we've gotten another glimpse of the new Fable game at the Xbox showcase recently. Now, we haven't seen any gameplay yet, but we have seen that some British humour has definitely been coming through, and I'm feeling really hopeful about the game. Fable is a series with a long history. Created by the now shut down Lionhead Studios, it was one of the first RPGs that I ever played that had a lot of big choices, where the choices would really matter and they had quite a big impact on the game. Mass Effect would later do a similar thing, but Fable is the first place that I saw it. The Fable series really is one of my favourites and is probably one of the big reasons why I really enjoy RPGs these days. And now that there's quite a lot of excitement for the new one, I thought it might be fun to talk about my experience with Fables 1, 2 and 3. Fable 2 was my entry point into the series, and that's just because the Xbox 360 was the first Xbox that I had. I didn't have one of the original ones. Gaming magazines were a big thing back then, and I happened to spot a very small article about Fable 2 in, I think, something like X360 magazine. This was still quite a while before release, so there wasn't a lot of detail or anything like that, but there was, I think, a picture of a hob which caught my eye, and it spoke a little bit about a living world and some RPG systems, and that information stayed in the back of my head right up until the game was released. For anyone who hasn't played any of the Fable series, they are these action combat RPGs where you have three styles that you're able to fight with. You've got very distinct melee, ranged, and magic styles of combat. In theory, you could specialise in any one of these combat styles, but in practice, if you play for long enough, you get enough experience points, you kind of become really strong at all of them, and all of them are pretty viable to run with. There are a good range of spells to choose from that you can put your experience points into, and then on the melee and range side of things, there's plenty of passive buffs that you can unlock, that give you more damage, or, give you a dodge roll, that kind of thing. The combat is fun. You could maybe say that it's a little simple for games nowadays, but for the time it was really, really good, and I really enjoyed just playing the game and taking part in the combat. There wasn't a minimap or any quest markers. Instead, you followed a trail of glitter in the world to get to your next objective, and it kept you focused on what's around you. You kept looking around the world, which I really, really like. And of course, this was the original dog companion game, and in my opinion, still one of the best to implement it. To me though, one of the big reasons to play and replay the game was the way that you interact with the world and change it depending on decisions that you make. So an early example of this is when you're playing through the tutorial, you're a child, and you're asked by one of the guards there to round up some arrest warrants that he has lost. When you collect these, one of the local criminals corners you and says that he will give you the same reward if you give him the warrants instead of giving them to the guard. Now, if you give the warrants to the guard, then there's a time skip later on, and when you come back to the city, you can see that one of the districts becomes the best neighborhoods in the city. Everything's really well taken care of. There's lovely plants everywhere, happy citizens. Essentially, because you gave those warrants to that guard, they were able to run the criminals out of town. If you give those same warrants to the criminal instead, well, that neighborhood becomes really run down, destroyed houses, people living in fear. And that's because the guards just weren't able to keep crime at bay in that neighborhood. That's one of the earliest examples, but there are plenty like it all through the game, and all three games, to be honest, have this kind of thing. Choosing who lives and who dies, whether you'll be a hero to the people or a menace to society, whether you'll sacrifice something or somebody for your own gain. There's lots of moral choices like that throughout all three games. And so because of these choices, it kind of used to be a bit of a cliche to say this about games, but I really think in Fable every playthrough can be and is different, and that is even more true when it comes to your character itself. There's plenty of customization in Fable 2 already when it comes to, choosing different weapons. You can get different items of clothing, you can dye the clothing, you can change your hairstyle, all of that kind of thing. And I always tried to make my hero look like the hero on the box art, but I could never quite manage it. I could never quite get the armor just right. But on top of that, sometimes the experience points that you choose can affect your appearance as well. So for example, if you put a lot of points into strength, your hero's muscles grow. If you put a lot of points into magic, you slowly get these sort of blue energy veins that sort of course through you. And then the actions you take out in the world affect your appearance too. If you play the hero, you get a halo. If you play the villain and you kill lots of guards and you sacrifice people, you start to look a lot more like a devil. So I hope you can see that the game already has quite a lot of depth to it, and that really is just when it comes to combat and morality. But on the other side of things, the game gives you plenty of different options to make money, to make in-game gold, that tie into that role-playing side of the game even more. One of the first jobs that you get when you return to the city after you grow up is you can be a blacksmith, and in fact you're forced to do blacksmithing for about 5 minutes while you wait for one of the main characters to show up. This is a fairly simple minigame to make money. You just have to time the button press right, and then you do that consecutively for a few times and you finish the sword and you make some money. You keep doing that, you level up enough, and each sword you make earns you more and more gold. And there are a few others like that, sort of things like woodcutting and bartending. If you want some more combat orientated jobs, there are things like assassination on the evil side of things, bounty hunting on the good side of things.
Hello. How would you like to earn some extra income ridding the land of criminals and rampaging monsters?
And to be honest, there are a few more that I never even knew about and have only found out having read up on them for this video. And those are civilian displacement or slave rescue. I don't remember playing any of those missions at all. My favourite way to make money in Fable 2 by far though was to become a bit of a property tycoon. Every single house, every single market stall and every single caravan in the campsite had a little notice next to it that you could press A on. And it would tell you a little bit about the stats of the house, but it would also allow you to buy it. Now, it was fairly expensive to start. Really, you can only get a small carriage in the gypsy camp to start with. But once you do, then you've got your first property and you're on the ladder. From there, you can move in if you want. You have a place to sleep or a place for your in-game spouse and children to live if you go down that route. But what I would do instead is I would rent out all the properties that I bought. And so what that does is it gives you sort of like a passive way to make gold in the game. The fun thing about the system in Fable 2 though was that it kind of seemed to work in real time. I was young, so I would go to school and then I would come back at the end of the day, load up the Xbox, play Fable 2, and I would get some money for the time that had passed while I was away, while I was at school. I'm not sure if it was calculated that you would get less for the time you weren't playing, but I definitely remember getting a lot of money from doing it this way. And then of course you would put that money back into buying more houses, more market stalls, whatever, and then you would start to build up your fortune that way. And the game even had a management system for housing which allowed you to raise or lower the rent depending on if you wanted to earn good or bad morality points alongside earning more or less money. So it tied back into that morality system as well. I played so many hours of Fable 2. I had so many different characters that I played. I took it in turns swapping the control of my brother all the time. We made different builds. We just messed around with the in-game dog. We, to be honest, laughed a lot at the immature humour.
I've spent a long time thinking of the exact right wording. And even longer getting it onto paper. Well, I am incorporeal after all.
And we just enjoyed being in that game, which is something I don't often get these days. And I've even barely talked about the story because I really did like the story a lot, but it wasn't what I spent the most time doing. Instead, it was just playing in the world of Fable 2, enjoying one of the best RPGs that I have ever played. I actually have 2 copies of the game. I'm not really sure why, because they're both on the Xbox 360. They both have discs and manuals, so perhaps I just lost one and then found it again later after I'd bought a replacement. So 2 copies, not sure why. But Fable 2 remains one of my favourite games to this day. So, after how much I loved Fable 2, I'm sure you can imagine just how excited I was for Fable 3. I even pre-ordered the special edition of the game, which comes with this book-style box, and you can slide open a secret compartment on the bottom, and it has this lovely coin with a blue and a red side in case you can't make an in-game decision, you can flip the coin. And it also comes with this deck of cards too, which has some really nice designs of the characters on it. Now, I wasn't really aware of this at the time, but Fable 2 suffered from a fair bit of over-promising. I was maybe too young to follow it all, but the studio head liked to make these grand promises about what would be in the game, and a fair number of them didn't turn out like expected or even make it into the game at all. Unfortunately, the same thing happened with Fable 3, and I was more aware of it this time around. I'm going to give 2 examples that I noticed and remember the most. The first one was that we were told we wouldn't have to keep going into the menus to switch things up anymore. You know, menus were boring, they pulled you out of the game, that was the promise, we wouldn't have to do that. It sounded great in principle, but instead what happened when you paused the game, you would teleport to your sanctuary, and then to access menus, instead you had to walk into the right room for what you wanted to do. So there would be a room for changing armor, there'd be a room for changing weapons, that kind of thing. You get into the room and your armor is sort of laid out on these mannequins, and you have to walk up to the right one, and that's how you would switch armor. I like the idea of no menus in principle, and I do see where they're coming from with it, and it was kind of cool to be able to walk around your menu, but really it just made everything take a little bit longer. You know, if you wanted to go from your weapons to your armor, you had to come out of the room and back into another one. Really, it just made everything take a little bit longer and ended up being not quite as fun. So that was the first thing. The second thing was living weapons in Fable 3. And actually, I really like this idea, and I really think that it could have become a bit of an RPG staple if it had been done correctly in this game. Your first weapons, the heroic weapons, they started off looking pretty plain with very basic stats, but over time as you did things in the world, they changed in appearance. So for example, if you open 10 chests, your sword might take on a golden and more complex hilt. If you kill 50 wolves, then the blade would turn black. Kill 30 villagers and it begins to constantly drip blood. I love this feature so much. I did play the game a couple of times, and I always enjoyed seeing which requirements would be the 5 that I would unlock on my weapon to see how the look completely customized itself to what I'd done in the world. Your sword or hammer or gun was unique to you, and that's always a good thing. I think it's always great to have more personalization in the game, and this was personalization that was based on what you did rather than just you choosing something, which is very different to what happens nowadays. So it sounds really cool, right? You got your own weapons that are very personal to you. You can show your friends who also play the game, have a look and see what each other's look like. It sounds really good. So why didn't it work? Well, there was a minor issue where sometimes you would get an aesthetic appearance that you really didn't like, and as far as I knew at the time, there wasn't a way to change it. I'm not sure if there was one that I missed, but I couldn't ever change it. But really the main problem was that these weapons, as cool as they looked, they just sucked. The look of the weapon evolved, but the stats didn't, and they were your starter weapons, so they were very quickly outscaled by the more static weapons that you found in the world, and especially legendary weapons. They were just so much stronger. Now, your character could get strong enough in your own stats, earning enough experience points and leveling up to overcome that somewhat, but it still felt bad that you would have to give yourself a handicap to use the unique and more personal equipment. Now, all of those complaints aside, I think Fable 3 was still a pretty good game. It wasn't my favourite, and I didn't replay it as much as, say, Fable 2, and although I did enjoy the gameplay, I think mostly that was down to the story. I generally liked it a lot less, and they forced some things that I wasn't a fan of. They sort of tried some big switch-ups and gotcha moments that I didn't think worked very well, and towards sort of the 3/4 mark of the game, you had to make a choice that just generally felt bad. There wasn't really a way to make a good choice. You either made everyone hate you, or most of the world died, and it was very hard to avoid those. Overall though, I do think Fable 3 was still a good game. It just didn't quite live up to the expectations that I think a lot of people had for it. To a lot of people though, it was their first Fable game, and it remained their favourite even after playing 1 or 2, and you can see why. You know, there are a lot of features that were more streamlined in this game and made more fun because of it being sort of a more modern version of the Fable world. So after Fable 3, it didn't really look like we were going to get another mainline Fable game. They did some spin-offs that I didn't really get into, and at points I started to miss the main Fable games. So I tried to play Fable 1 a few times over the years, mostly bouncing off it, but then only recently, I think about 4 years ago, I actually did manage to get into it properly when I played Fable Anniversary. Now, even with this updated offering, the version of the game is still very old at this point, and I couldn't help but think that it felt clunky to play. But on the other hand, this game probably has the most charm out of any of the Fable games, and so if you can get around the clunky combat, it is still a whole load of fun. Once you've played all 3 games in this series, you can kind of tell that the earlier in the series you go, so Fable 1, the more of those RPG systems that you get. A big example of this is armor. So Fable 1 actually has armor that you can put on that change your stats rather than just change your appearance, whereas in Fable 2 and 3, all armor does is change how your hero looks. It doesn't have any effect on your stats at all. Don't get me wrong, I didn't have a problem with this when I played Fable 2. It's just something I noticed when we went back and played Fable 1, that some of the features have been stripped back a little bit. Speaking of that old school fantasy setting, the first Fable game revolves around the Heroes Guild. You're recruited, you grow up training, and then you do missions to help the inhabitants of the world of Fable. Or, in classic Fable style, if you want, you can choose to harm them instead. There's a 500-year gap between the 2 games, and the setting has changed enough that you can tell the difference. So if you are into more of a classic fantasy game, then Fable 1 might be the one for you. After playing through the whole game and then having played all 3 games, I think that the story in the first game is the best one, and I know that the villain in the first game is the best one. Jack of Blades is a great combination of creepy and terrifying, and in comparison, the villains in the other 2 games can feel a bit lackluster. It's a really good RPG, and a lot of people have this one as their favourite. It's close for me, but I think just down to playing Fable 2 first, that one stays in the top spot. But I will say that the Lost Chapters DLC from Fable 1 is absolutely phenomenal. I said at the start of the video, but the Fable series really is one of my favourite RPG series and probably one of my favourite game series in general. I'm really looking forward to the new one. I really hope it can live up to, particularly for me, Fable 2, but all three of the games really. I really hope that the new one can live up to that. If you're wondering whether it's worth going back and trying some of the old ones out in anticipation of the new Fable game, then I definitely think it is. You should try it out. Between all three games, there is something for everybody. Thanks to backwards compatibility, they're all playable, and actually if you have Game Pass, then you can already play them. Now, I feel like I've talked for a long time, but there are still so many more aspects to these games that I haven't managed to talk about, and I think I could spend hours waffling on about Fable. And in fact, writing this video has made me want to go and play them again. There's a lot of games fighting for my attention at the moment, but maybe I can fit another run of Fable 3 in sometime, since it's the one that I remember the least. If you're about to dive into the world of Fable, then buckle up, Chicken Chaser. You're in for one hell of a journey.